Sup guys, this is an in-depth guide on heavy and large cruiser guns for Azur lane. If you're just looking for something quick and concise, you'll have to look elsewhere. Although this is a guide on heavy cruiser guns, I'm just going to leave out the large cruisers when I'm referring to the guns because it's too much of a mouthful. In general, Vanguard equipment do not have nearly as much of an impact on your overall damage output compared to main fleet equipment, so you should definitely start by mastering battleship guns and carrier planes first. I have already made guides for those equipment types, and I'll link the playlist in the description. Also found within the playlist is a guide on enemy armor types, which you must know for all equipment, so if you don't know what I'm referring to, then you should start with that. The goal of these guides is to teach you why each gun is good, and use existing equipment as examples of how these ideas are applied in practice. If you understand everything in this video, you should be able to evaluate future equipment for yourself. For a complete beginner, the amount of information may be overwhelming, but you can watch the video multiple times. I'll also leave timestamps so that you can skip any parts you feel like you already know. I will begin with the basics, and then talk about the physical properties of the guns, and then talk about some relevant guns. Now, let's get into the basics. Heavy cruiser guns scale primarily with firepower and main gun efficiency. The exact formula for how damage is calculated can be found on the damage calculations page on the wiki. I go through examples of calculating gun damage in the Battleship Guns Guide, so you can check that out for an example, and apply the same process for heavy cruiser guns if you're curious. There are heavy cruisers which rely more on their main gun than others. For example, Hindenburg is a ship which can have up to 3 heavy cruiser guns. Exactly as it sounds, this means that she fires the guns she equips 3 times per reload cycle. With each of them having 130% efficiency, this means that the total multiplier on her guns from gun mounts and efficiencies alone is 390%. Compare this to Napoli, who has 1 heavy cruiser gun at 150%, and Hindenburg's multiplier from slots alone is 2.6 times more than Napoli's. There are more things that go into their damage, such as their skills and buffs, but the difference in their loadout already points to a pretty big difference in their damage distribution. This means that it's more important to give Hindenburg the appropriate and best guns you have, because more of her damage comes from them, as opposed to Napoli, who gets more of her damage from her secondary guns as well as her so-called barrages. As for why Hindenburg has 3 guns even though she can only equip 2, her first slot has 2 guns. There are many Vanguard ships with 2 main gun mounts, and yes, it doubles the damage output of their equipment. Ships with 2 main gun mounts are commonly referred to as gunboats. Usually, they'll have trade-offs such as having weaker torpedoes and barrages to compensate for having an entire extra gun, but regardless, it is one of the best features for a ship to have. Okay, now I'll go through each of the properties, also known as the ballistics of heavy cruiser guns. First, this is the list of heavy cruiser guns on the wiki, a very useful resource. I removed some of the irrelevant guns from the table below to reduce clutter, so don't be alarmed when you open the page and a bunch of weird guns that aren't here show up. There are 4 different types of ammo: HE, AP, SAP, and normal. HE shells are red and have a low chance to set enemies on fire. AP shells are whitish blue and SAP shells are purple. They can both pierce 1 and hit up to 2 enemies. Normal shells don't really do anything special. There are different names for the different types of HE and AP and normal, but just forget that and look at the armor modifiers of each gun. There are general rules like HE being the best against light armor, but the modifiers are all over the place, so it's really just best to look at the armor mods. This right here is a screenshot of a pretty typical position for your Vanguard and the enemy. I'll be drawing arrows on top to illustrate the effect of each property. Next up is shell speed, which you can find at the top in the table here. I kind of wish they put this in the table below with all the other ballistics though, because it's pretty important. Shell speed is exactly as it sounds: how fast the shell flies. The paths of shells are mostly horizontal. If the enemy is stationary or moving horizontally, shell speed doesn't really matter, but if they're moving vertically, then the higher the shell speed, the faster it'll reach the target before they move out of its trajectory. From my experience, guns firing 160 speed shells are pretty bad at hitting targets with any kind of vertical movement, and of course it improves as the shells get faster and faster. The difference between 160 and 180 or 200 is quite noticeable, but from 200 to 220 there are definitely diminishing returns. It's not like 220 speed means they'll never miss an enemy moving vertically or anything. Now, we go down to the table with all the guns to see the other ballistics. First is the range. All these guns have enough range to hit the enemy across the entire field, so I'll talk about it more when I get to destroyer guns, which is the gun type impacted most by the difference in range. Moving on, we have the spread, which I believe is probably the most impactful stat outside of DPS for heavy cruiser guns. The spread is a range in front of your ship that dictates the angle at which the shells can be randomly fired. If we had something like a 120-degree range, you would have something that looks like this, and every shot would be fired at a random angle within this range. Heavy cruiser guns I would consider to be relevant have spreads of 12 to 22 degrees. The further away the shells travel, the further away they can be from the exact point they were targeted at. If the enemy is point blank in front of the gun, it doesn't really matter what the spread is and they will still get hit, but if the enemy likes to hang out really far away, I have found that guns as low as 18 degrees can still miss occasionally, and that is against a stationary enemy. At 15 degrees though, the hit rate against a stationary target is pretty much 100%. In general, guns with fewer barrels have lower spread than guns with more barrels, making them more accurate at long ranges, but not many enemies linger at extreme distances. Next up is the angle value. The angle dictates where the gun can find a target to shoot at. An angle of 360 degrees means that the gun can aim and fire in any direction. 180 degrees would be a semicircle in front of the ship, 120 a cone, and for heavy cruiser guns, they have angles between 38 and 50 degrees. I used to think that the angle had a big impact on heavy cruiser guns, but nowadays I do not think it is the case and rather spread is more important. When you go from a gun like the Drake gun with a 38-degree lock-on angle to the Hindenburg gun with a 50-degree angle, there is a difference of 6 degrees on both sides. There is only a difference in performance if, for some reason, the only target that can be locked onto occupy this little purple space, but as both of your vanguard and the enemy are likely moving constantly, they tend to quickly enter the middle zone as well. If the angle made a difference, you would expect to see that the Hindenburg gun would deal more damage than the Drake gun against heavy armor, because its DPS is just slightly lower, but its angle is 12 degrees higher. However, I tested the two guns against the heavy armor raid event boss, and the difference in damage was the same as the difference on paper, suggesting that the angle did not make much of a difference, if any, in practice. There's also the attribute column here, but all heavy cruiser guns are lock-on, so there's nothing really to talk about. The ammo will be included in the DPS columns, so we can skip over it. On the left side here, we have the round, which is the firing pattern. 2x3 means 2 rounds of 3 shells each time, for example. The coefficient is just the multiplier on damage. BT is the volley time, which is the time between the first round and the last round in a salvo. Cooldown does not start ticking until the last round is fired, so the total cooldown of a gun is its cooldown stat, plus the volley time, plus the absolute cooldown of 0.3 seconds. Okay, now we're ready to look at some specific examples of good guns and guns to avoid. Unlike main fleet equipment, the DPS values actually paint a pretty accurate picture of relative performance for Vanguard guns. Let's begin with light armor. By the way, the max rarity tab lists plus 10 stats, while the max enhance tab lists plus 13 stats. Sorting the table by light DPS, these guns come to the top. Baked into the DPS numbers is the base damage, coefficient, volley time, cooldown, absolute cooldown, and armor mods. What is not included though are the ballistics and the firepower bonus. This sorted list right here already gets you like 90% of the way there. I will highlight the ones that do not perform to their DPS and explain the reasons as to why. First up is the 203 Mark 8 prototype. It has 22 degrees of spread as well as the slow 160 speed HE shells, so in practice its hit rate against either far away targets or targets moving vertically suffers greatly. It's not better than the 2, maybe even 3 guns below it. It upgrades directly into the Mark 10 here. The Mark 10 does have a pretty significantly higher DPS, but it still retains the exact same ballistics as the Mark 9. Since I have never crafted the Mark 9, I have never used the Mark 10 either, but I can see its performance against specifically light armor being on par with Drake gun. By the way, if you don't know nicknames of very commonly referred to equipment like Drake gun, I will link a nicknames guide in the description that you can check out. So back to the Mark 10, it has 20 less firepower than the Drake gun and lower shell speed, which is why I would hesitate to say that it's better than the Drake gun despite its higher DPS. Next is the 203 MLE. It also has the slower 160 speed HE shells. Additionally, it fires 3 shells in a straight line, and it has a very tight spread. In fact, the spread is so tight that it actually becomes a detriment. 12 degrees is already accurate enough to not miss, so going down to 10 degrees has no gain. However, having a tighter spread means that the shells cover less area vertically, so they are even more prone to miss against a vertically moving enemy. Both its shells as well as its pattern hold it back from being worth the price compared to the gun right below it, which is the Twin 203 MLE. Not only does it have special faster HE shells, it's also a twin gun with a slightly larger spread, which helps it slightly against vertically moving enemies. By the way, the Unzen gun, which is the rainbow gun at the top, also has the faster HE shells. And everything else is pretty much about as the order dictates. If you're new, I would suggest starting with the Twin 203 third year type because of its accessibility. Just click on equipment and the methods to obtain it will be listed here. You can upgrade it to the enhanced version in the Gear Lab, as purple materials are not super hard to come by, but I would definitely stop before the gold one. The next step would be the Twin 203 MLE here, which punches above its weight class thanks to its ballistics. You can honestly skip it though if you have the Unzen gun and a Drake gun, as you don't really need that many heavy cruiser guns. Also, if you happen to have any of these guns lying around already, just use any of them. There's no point in going out of your way to craft the Twin 203 MLE, even though it might be a tiny bit better, as the difference is barely noticeable and you will eventually replace all of them. There is one little trick that you can do though. The Twin 203 actually upgrades into the worst triple 203 in the Gear Lab. However, when you upgrade an equipment, it actually refunds 100% of the plates that you spent on the base version, so you can take the Twin 203 to plus 13, and eventually refund all the plates when you need them or have better options. At plus 13, with an 18% damage boost, the Twin 203 MLE hits harder than the Drake gun at plus 10, though it still loses to the Unzen gun at plus 10. However, it is the second best option after the Unzen gun if you don't want to commit any gold plates to heavy cruiser guns long term. Let's move on to medium armor now. Sorting by DPS, this is what we get. It's more or less accurate, although I would not recommend taking the SAP gun for anything other than medium armor, as its damage against the other two armor types is pitiful. Once again, if you only have the lower ranked guns lying around, the jump to the higher level gold guns isn't worth the cost, but you should use the better ones if you have the option. These two guns in particular are closer to the Drake gun against medium than you would expect looking at their paper DPS, thanks mostly to their tighter spreads and probably to some degree the higher shell speeds. The starting point is the Twin 203 here, which is obtainable through iron-bladed tech boxes early on. Everything under this is completely irrelevant. Also, the Unzen gun is better than the few triple guns above it thanks to its extra firepower bonus. It also does have tighter spread, but the benefits from that are cancelled out by its slower shells. Finally, we have the heavy options. As you can see, the best heavy cruiser guns deal 57.5 and 54 DPS against light and medium armor, while the best against heavy is only about 40.5, so heavy cruiser guns, and really Vanguard guns in general, should not be relied upon against heavy armor. I would encourage you to not go for a specific heavy cruiser gun for its anti-heavy damage, and just use whatever you already have that is the best option for the job. The order here also pretty much tells the entire story. One more thing, for mixed armor situations like campaign, Drake gun's armor mods are the most well balanced. Hindenburg gun also hits 2 out of 3 armor types really hard, and it also has Pierce on top, making it ideal for late game stages with many medium and heavy armor threats, but before then, the Drake gun is king. That's pretty much it for heavy cruiser guns. More than anything, I hope that I was able to impart onto you how to evaluate the guns, rather than which guns are the best. Before wrapping up the video, I'll also cover large cruiser guns. They fire at an arc and ignore enemy shields. They also deal damage in an area where they land, making them more similar to battleship guns than heavy cruiser guns really. Against light armor, the Azur gun is the only real choice. If neither the arcing nor the AoE comes into play, for example against a single light armor boss, and the ship's kit does not rely on having a large cruiser gun, then the Unzen gun can perform better than the Azur gun. An example would be ships like Brest and Kala Ideas against a boss like Wichita Meta or Helena Meta. Against medium armor, the DPS numbers pretty much tell the entire story, but the Kronstadt gun is even better than the A-Gear gun, even more than the DPS suggests due to its bigger AoE. Against heavy armor, the breast gun appears to be in second place, but I would not bother with it because it has atrocious reload and it's really bad against the other two armor types. Once again, I'm advocating against crafting a Vanguard gun for specifically heavy armor, especially when it's not even the best possible option. The purple gun here can be equipped on some Ironblood heavy cruisers. It functions like a large cruiser gun, so it's better in the sense that it can ignore shields and hit multiple enemies. They're quite good for those ships in particular, but lose hard to the rainbow heavy cruiser guns unless you're specifically fighting against shielded enemies. Okay, that should be it for the heavy and large cruiser guns. Hope you found the information helpful. Thanks for watching, and see you in the next one.